Let me welcome all of you to Chat with Matt. Let me spotlight myself. The purpose of Chat with Matt is to find people to speak to us about things that I think you'll find interesting and important to your work. Today's Chat with Matt features Brian Weld from Cushman & Wakefield. And just to give you a little background, there was at one point in time, our New York City chapter was homeless, and it wasn't really possible for them to get a large enough tent in Central Park to meet. So we were scrambling. We used to meet at Wright Associates in what was the Pan Am building. It was a great location, but they finally booted us out, and we were wandering New York City for a while until we met up with Brian Weld. So Brian was kind enough to tackle all of the corporate naysayers and get us allowed into the building. We had to promise not to throw any of the television sets into the swimming pool, but there weren't any swimming pools or television sets per se in the building. So, and we promised to behave ourselves. We told them we were just mild-mannered accountants. So Brian's got a wealth of experience in real estate that has been his whole life. I always enjoy hearing people's careers, and Brian's going to start out with that. I tend to let my speakers introduce themselves. I've been introduced at many meetings, and the people introducing me always botch it in some way and make me cringe. So with no further ado, I'm going to also spotlight Brian. Will be bouncing in and out as we talk about real estate, but Brian's going to begin by giving us a little 90-second announcement on how he got to where he is. So Brian, please take it away and start the conversation on Chat with Matt. So Brian, welcome to Chat with Matt.
Thank you for that introduction. And just a little background on me. I currently work at Cushman & Wakefield, which is a global real estate services firm. We have close to 55,000 employees, 400 offices, over 60 countries. But Matt thought it would be interesting for me to describe my pathway into the real estate business. And through my father, I was all the TV, movie activity in New York City. So I worked on a few movies, which I may be dating myself, but Superman, The Exorcist, my big effort was the king of comedy. And those of you that used to watch soap operas or, you know, in former years, I was also employed at the Edge of Night. And I graduated from the Honors College at University of Michigan, and I was working on location in New York City. And I happened to meet a young lady. We dated for a while, and she introduced me to her boss, who worked at a leading real estate advisory firm. And I told him that I was interested in getting into real estate. I was at that time out looking at different buildings that I thought I might have a chance to purchase. And I actually joined an investment group, and we bought a residential building on the Upper East Side, in which we doubled our money in the space of about 18 months. And he was kind enough to give me his name as part of a letter of introduction that I sent out to a number of real estate firms. And I interviewed at all those firms, and I was, employed by a small firm because I thought that was kind of the best way to start out. And that was February of 1981. And the real estate market was just coming out of a slowdown. So my timing was pretty good, and I've been at it ever since. And my commitment is to serve and protect the interests of tenants. And I fully utilize the resources of my firm and the different service lines that we have to fulfill that commitment on behalf of the tenants that I represent. And it's a wide-ranging practice. We have a great expertise in the Chinese business community. One of my former colleagues Stephen Rockefeller, who now works as a strategic advisor to the team. Obviously, his name in China carries and continues to carry a great deal of weight, given the 100-year legacy that his family has in China. And Matt Ettlinger, who's been with me for over 10 years, and Jennifer Song also works as a strategic advisor. So it's a wide-ranging practice, and I'm proud to say that I have over 106 personal letters of recommendation from the different tenants that I've been honored to represent over the course of my career.
So that's a good start. So we should talk about why you, when I was, as I was telling Brian earlier, our agency, about halfway through my time at the firm, decided we needed to look at more real estate because we were growing so fast. And I was getting cold called, once the word got out, I was getting cold called by brokers almost every day. And I made the mistake of not working with just one person and having people drive me around Manhattan. And then they were making claims that as we passed by buildings, they had shown it to me. So I learned very quickly the dangers of not working exclusively with someone. But Brian, you're the expert here. Why don't you discuss what it is involved, what's involved in actually representing somebody?
Well, good point. Typically, we're interviewed like any other service provider, and I walk them through our due diligence process, which I think is a real differentiator between us and a lot of our competitors. And then we have a standard letter of engagement, which basically says that we're authorized to represent them in the marketplace. Unlike some of my competitors, there are no handcuffs there. If they feel that we're not delivering the quality of service that I promised, they have the right to terminate the agreement after a trial period of 3 to 4 months. I had one or two instances. For example, I interviewed at an accounting firm, and they were using the services of another competitor. And they said, well, we really like what you have to say. We're very impressed. This is a very detailed presentation, and we would like to hire you.
Mhm.
The only difficulty is we have an agreement with another firm. And I said, well, typically you have the right to cancel that, but let me take a look at the agreement. And the agreement was for more than a year. And it said in the very last paragraph, this agreement can only be canceled by mutual agreement. So
Oh,
obviously the broker is not going to consent to being terminated. So they were basically handcuffed, even though they weren't receiving the quality of service that they should. They were unable to, hire us. So as they say in the contracts, read the small print.
yeah.
So just to walk you through very quickly kind of the process that we go through, it's not, showing space is sort of a very small part of the equation.
Mhm.
The first thing that we do is we have what I call the Strategic Advisory Services Group. So they're the group that runs all the comparative financial analytics. So one of the first things that we do is we run a remaining lease obligation. We get a copy of the lease. We get a copy of the last 12 months of rent bills, just to thoroughly understand exactly what they're currently paying per square foot in the event that renewing becomes a possibility. The other thing that we do in concert with that is we run an audit to make sure that there has not been any overcharges in their bills or their escalations. And one of the things that's very sort of insidious about real estate is that there can be a very small error, but over the course of 5 or 6 or 7 years of a lease, a small error can grow into a serious amount of money. 80% or 85% of the time when we run this audit, we find that everything's been billed properly. But we had 1 or 2 instances where the overcharges amounted to over $200,000. So we were able to recapture that overcharge by vehicle of a rent credit. So that's one of the things that we provide just as part of our initial due diligence. And it's also something that we provide to tenants after the completion of the deal. So, once the lease is signed, we're still there. A lot of the work that I do is for pre-held companies. So we really function as their offsite real estate department.
Ah,
Cushman is a very, very large firm. We have a lot of heft in the marketplace. We have tremendous resources, extensive relationships. So, we run audits on an annual basis to make sure that our tenants are not being overcharged. We're also on standby in case there's any issues with, air conditioning. I I represented an environmental engineering firm many years ago called O'Brien and Gear. They were headquartered up in Syracuse.
mhm.
And I leased them space at 111 8th Avenue, which at that time was probably, a $16 building. And now it's probably north of, $70 because it's really become a very vigorous telecom hub. But their complaint was the toilet tissue. And so they called me up and they said, this is not satisfactory. And so I wrote a letter detailing the issue to the landlord, and they responded to the problem very quickly, and my tenant was happy. So I think it's important to realize that sometimes, tenants, they don't have the leverage sometimes with a landlord after the lease has been signed. And, Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly, but carry a big stick. Well, we're the big stick. So we're able to back up tenants and get them the services that they deserve in the event that the landlord is sort of trying to cut corners a little bit.
I was telling you, we went ahead and we leased 3 floors down at 355 Park Avenue South. And my, I don't know if I mentioned this, but my father was a plumbing contractor, so I know enough about construction to be dangerous. But anyway, part of our negotiations with the landlord when we took the space was he was very insistent that we do air handling equipment instead of putting an air conditioning unit on the roof. He wanted us to do it for us, and that particular space backed up on the armory.
Right.
And my sense was there probably wasn't enough air back there. And that summer, after we occupied our space, was the hottest summer in New York City in 20 years. And it was
Right.
ghastly in our office. And the landlord ended up paying, because we were very careful in wording our lease, the landlord ended up paying to put the air conditioning units on the roof.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
Yeah. I
have
mean, it's all about doing your due diligence ahead of time to make sure that you don't get any of those unexpected costs.
right, and they can be huge for a small firm.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
Real
mean,
estate
that's one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to when we're inspecting a space. We take a look at the air conditioning system. I represented two advertising firms, and one of the deals that we did for them in Midtown South, and sometimes tenants don't realize that they can appoint a broker like us to represent them in a renewal.
Mhm.
And, they received a proposal from the landlord saying, the best we can do for you is a deal at $60 a foot. Fortunately, they hired us. We got them a deal starting at 50 with a below market annual escalation. We got them 5 months of free rent. We got them an initial cash contribution of about $9 a foot to deal with some deferred maintenance. We got them another cash contribution of $20 a foot to deal with a total renovation of the space. And most importantly, we thoroughly inspected the AC unit, and we got language in the lease that at the tenant's option, the landlord has to replace the entire air conditioning system, including a new economizer, which is what's required by code. And this would require the expansion of the mechanical equipment room. And we estimate that saved the tenant probably about $270,000.
Yeah,
So,
a
it's
lot of
all
money.
about getting into the details. Yeah. For,
You just want to be in a position to
uh,
occupy the space. You don't want to get involved in all the other stuff. I had, again, a situation with our space where the, the broker who was working with us, as we were walking between buildings in Manhattan, said, and those will be your elevators. And what he meant by that was I would be responsible for maintaining them. And I said,
Right.
right, that's not happening.
Yeah.
I
Right.
get involved as a tenant in mechanical equipment in a building, and especially the elevators, which, you know, they go all the way down to the basement, and we only had 3 floors.
Right. Yep.
Crazy. But
I
people
mean,
do
yeah,
things. You need a tenant's representative to really read the agreement.
yeah, exactly. I mean, the first thing that we do is kind of do our homework. We have a very detailed pre-programming questionnaire that we ask the tenant to fill out. So that way we can thoroughly understand exactly how much space they need, how their different employees will be accommodated, and what the forecast is for growth. Because obviously, you know, if you need 10,000 square feet now, but you're going to need another 3,000 or 4,000 square feet in a couple of years, we need to take account for that in how we structure the lease and any options to expand. Um, you know, that's kind of a critical component of the overall process. We then put together a very detailed timeline so that way everyone understands exactly what needs to be done at what time. We urge the tenant to assemble their team early on. So that could be, you know, architect, engineer, real estate attorney, telecom specialist, et cetera, because obviously we need to understand what the backbone within a particular building is to make sure that they're going to have the internet service providers that they need. Um, and we do a tremendous amount of due diligence. We have probably a 100-point different checklist that we go through when we look at space. You know, oftentimes people, when they look at space, you know, they look at the lobby, they walk into the space, they look at the view, et cetera, but there's, you know, countless issues that need to be addressed so that way you can thoroughly understand whether a space is going to be the optimal fit for a particular tenant. So, you know, we're
But
looking at air conditioning, we're looking at,
do
sorry,
you
go
do
ahead.
employee surveys? You know, especially in Manhattan, I was very concerned about where people were coming in from. We were at Grand Central
Right.
Station, and, you know, maybe you had some people coming in from Long Island, and you're going to, if you, what I used to say is, if you move the office a foot, somebody's going to be unhappy.
Right. Well, that's one of the things that we do, you know, particularly if it's a larger tenant that has more than, you know, 50 or 60 employees. We run a full kind of demographic analysis. We get the zip codes of all the different employees. And this way we can plot with a great deal of accuracy how the different commuting times of the different employees will be impacted by a location in comparison, like in Midtown South or Midtown South on the west side or Grand Central or downtown. When you look at the different subways that access those different sites, you know, we're able to plot with a great deal of accuracy exactly how different people's commuting times will be affected. And that goes a long way into determining exactly what the optimal location is for a particular business, particularly now when, you know, if you're dealing with a tech company, you know, they're going to look to cater to employees that are less than 30 years old. And, you know, they're going to want a particular location more in Midtown South where they can, you know, hang out with their friends after work. And also, you know, you want good delivery service. So that way, maybe employees don't have to go out for lunch. You can have good food delivery service during lunchtime to keep people on site. And, you know, there's a lot of issues that kind of go into selecting the right location.
Yeah, and
The other
it's
thing that
important to have somebody to walk you through all those issues. Their space is a very brittle thing, but as long as the management team has discussed it, um, it's their decision.
yeah,
But they don't always know they don't know what they don't know. So it's very helpful to have somebody who's been through all the wars guiding you through the process.
yeah, I mean, particularly if you're going to be looking at a location downtown, you know, we have a map of all the flood zones from Superstorm Sandy.
Mm.
And, you know, a lot of the buildings have obviously reconfigured themselves, put, you know, the critical infrastructure and life safety, mechanical equipment on a higher floor. But it's important to take those issues into account, because obviously, climate change is an element of our day-to-day life. And I think it's realistic to think that in the coming years, we will have another Superstorm Sandy. So if you're going to select a location downtown, it's important to take that kind of, element into account.
Oh, for sure, for sure. So why don't you talk a little bit about you said Midtown, downtown, Midtown South, they're all very different places.
Yep.
How do you walk clients through that? I assume there are
So
some,
let's, I
and
mean,
back, as they say, back in the day, the advertising agencies, a lot of them were moving from Madison Avenue, right?
right,
Which was where all the agencies were located, down to Midtown South. And
right.
for us, that was considered, but I ended up finding something in just Midtown South for us.
Right.
And I looked at all the factors that you just described, where people were living. I had to give up almost all my CFO duties to focus on this, because it
Right.
is complex. But why don't you talk through the different places? I assume there still are people who are moving from Midtown down to downtown.
Yeah, I mean, Midtown South is no longer the low-cost alternative for some of the reasons that I cited before, where, there's a real kind of TAMI, which is an acronym for Technology, Advertising, Media, and Information. There's a real ecosystem for that down in Midtown South. So you have a lot of the tech firms, that's really their location of choice. And as a result, prices down there have really skyrocketed, and in a lot of instances are actually more expensive than some of the premier locations in Midtown.
Wow.
But to answer your question, when you look at a Midtown lease, there are basically 4 or 5 different elements. You have the rent, you have the free rent, you have the escalation for real estate taxes, which is in every commercial lease in New York City. And then you have some kind of annual increase, either tied to a percentage increase or operating expenses, which are tied into the operating expenses for the building. And for a tenant, that's the most favorable escalation to secure, because obviously the landlord is interested in keeping the operating expenses as low as possible, because that impacts their NOI, or their net operating income. So when you're negotiating a lease, that's something that you try to secure, or you try to secure a percentage increase that basically mimics what the increase would be for operating expenses. The other thing would be electricity. And if you're a large enough user, the way that electricity can be billed is negotiable. I had a situation with a tenant over on the west side on 7th Avenue. It was 2 brothers. Their father had started the firm, and initially they occupied 7 floors. By the time I represented them, they were down to 2 floors. And after they appointed me, I said, can I see your lease? And they said, well, what do you need to see that for? We're probably going to move. I said, just, do me a favor. You hired me to do a job. Let me do my job. So I got a copy of their lease, and I went through it, and I realized, in consultation with Gary Rosenberg, whose expertise is really electrical billing and operating expenses, we came to the conclusion that over the course of their tenancy, they had been overcharged about $1 million for their electricity. And it took me basically 2.5 to 3 weeks to renegotiate the language in their lease dealing strictly with electric billing. And as it turned out, they decided to renew. So, that was a cost savings that we were able to secure for them that they were totally unaware of, because who pays attention to electrical billing? You get the bill, you pay the bill, and that's it.
Yeah.
So when you
the reverse,
compare,
our landlord
right,
that moved forgot to bill us for our electricity for over a year.
right.
And
Well,
when
there
they
you
came
go.
back, they said, we haven't been charging you. I said, yes, I know. I had checked with our attorneys and I was told I didn't have to tell them.
Right, sure,
And
exactly.
it was, when they finally sent us a bill for the time period, it was a lot less than I had been accruing. So I was very
That's
happy.
good. Well,
But all those things happen in
um,
Manhattan.
yeah,
It's something that is not really your core business as a CFO. You're just trying to manage your space. And unfortunately, everybody needs, well, back
right,
in the, everyone needed at least 180 square feet, each employee. So you could just kind of multiply that out. That's
right,
what, and you knew how much square footage you need. Just rough numbers,
right.
right? But then you're factoring in,
Yep,
as I told you, we were growing 50% in one year. We took
yep,
two floors, and before we even got all the way through our plans, we needed the third floor, which I had secured a contiguous floor. I had an option on a contiguous third floor. It was just dumb luck, right?
right. Well, that's good. They were lucky to have you.
Yeah.
So
So
getting back to your
we can
question
talk
about
about
the point of
the rubber,
differentiation,
the New York rubber ruler. That's always a good topic.
well, I just wanted to answer your question about the difference between Midtown and Midtown South leases.
Oh, yes,
So
right. Sorry.
in Midtown, they have the elements that I referenced. Midtown South, they have those charges. And in addition, tenants often have to pay for their own cleaning. They have to pay for their own carting. They have to pay for air conditioning maintenance, all of which involves oftentimes the hiring of an outside service provider. And then there are additional charges for sprinkler administration, water, and sewer. And then in some cases, you have to pay your proportionate share of the security guard in the lobby. So,
Mhm.
interestingly enough, in Midtown South, there are a lot more kind of moving parts to a lease and a lot more elements that can be negotiated, uh, oftentimes than in a Midtown lease. So those are all the elements that you need to pay attention to really make sure that you're driving the occupancy cost down to the lowest possible number. And, you have to retain the right to use non-union if possible, if that's the preference of the tenant. And also, to secure the right vendor to maintain the AC. Obviously, you got to do your due diligence on the AC unit before you sign on to the lease. And, oftentimes we identify deferred maintenance that then the landlord has to pick up. And then we write the clause in the lease such that over and above just regular maintenance, which we peg at a certain number, the landlord is responsible for any and all substantial repairs, including, replacement of the condenser, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that, over the term of a lease can save a tenant a tremendous amount of money.
So
The other
COVID-19,
element, and referring
now that
to,
we were talking about these particular issues, COVID-19 has really thrown a monkey wrench into absolutely everything, has it not? There are people who have
yeah,
had
no,
their
I
own.
mean,
We have a very close friend who has a public relations firm, and of course, his offices have been empty for a year,
yeah,
and he's
yeah,
finally gotten around to deciding he's never going back to a full house, and he's given up a
right,
lot of his space. I'm
yeah.
tell us some stories. I'm sure everybody's been going nuts having their space empty. What is it, $70 a square foot?
Right. Um,
That's a
yeah, I
reasonable
mean,
amount of
obviously there's been a huge amount of, that's a very large amount of money, particularly if you're in, 5, 10, 15, 20,000 square feet. The way that the landlords defended themselves against a lot of legal strategies, most importantly would be force majeure, is to keep the buildings up and operational, fully
money.
staffed, elevators running, everything running. So that way they could say, well, you can come back to the office if you want. We're not stopping you. There's nothing that we as a landlord are doing that is preventing you from occupying the building. And in force majeure, oftentimes, there's no sort of language that deals with, dictates from the state government that, businesses need to shut down. Obviously, going forward in leases that we're going to negotiate, we're going to have language in there that deals with COVID and the fact that if there is a state agency that decrees that the business needs to reduce its occupancy below, 25% or 30% or whatever it is,
Mhm.
the tenant is thereby free to the obligation to pay rent. So going forward, obviously, we're going to have that language in all the leases that we negotiate.
Mhm.
The other thing that oftentimes tenants are now just becoming dimly aware of is the Climate Mobilization Act, which is local law 84 will be kind of the preview of that, and they will have rankings on buildings similar to what you see for restaurants as to the energy efficiency of a particular building.
Oh, okay.
In 7 years, this will now migrate into local law 97, where landlords will have to reduce their carbon footprint. And if they fail to do so, they will be subject to serious penalties. So obviously, as part of our work representing tenants, we need to make sure that all of those costs and all those obligations are the responsibility of the landlord. And we recently negotiated a deal in 650 Madison Avenue on behalf of a prominent
Mhm.
Chinese private equity group, and we made sure that that language is in there.
Yeah.
So, going forward, that's another kind of sneaky thing that you need to be aware of. The other thing that we take account of is local law 52, which has to do with the landlord's obligation to provide some kind of storage for tenants' bicycles, either on site or through, you
Oh,
know, a garage or something like that. Because obviously, post-COVID, we expect a lot more employees to want to continue to ride their bicycles to work until they're fully comfortable that they can resume transportation via the subway system.
I
The
think
other thing to take it,
one of the less
okay,
recognized facts is that landlords actually have bills to pay too, don't they?
yeah, they do.
But they're just in a
But
better
it's our
position, I would
job to make
imagine.
sure that,
I just would imagine
as
they're in a
much of
better
that obligation
financial
is pushed
position
over to the
to bear
landlord.
unusual costs.
Yeah.
They kind of plan for
And
that,
the
don't
other
they?
thing to, well, you would hope so. The other thing that we take account of is local law 11,
Mhm.
which is, I'm sure when you travel around the city, you see these sidewalk sheds,
Yeah.
which are basically put up when the landlord has to do facade work, which is mandated by local law 11. So every 5 years, the landlord is required, unless they do a more stringent search, in which case they can years, but they're required to do a facade inspection and to repair any deficiencies. And this law was precipitated by a very tragic event that happened up in Columbia University, where a gargoyle fell off a building and killed a student. And we
Right.
also had kind of a recapitulation of this in a building on 7th Avenue, where an architect was walking past the building and a piece of the facade fell off, and she was also killed. So,
Yeah.
it's important to
A
understand
real
where
thing.
the landlord stands in terms of that work, and also in terms of the cosmetics. If you're on the second or third floor of a building, you don't want to move in and then 6 months later have the sidewalk shed go up. So, we need to understand where the landlord is in terms of that timing. And then if it is going to happen within a short period after the tenant occupies, or even any time thereafter, we want language in the lease that requires the landlord to remove that shed as quickly as possible. And in fact, the city council has taken up this issue, and they will pass legislation mandating that, because a lot of landlords, the sidewalk shed goes up, and it stays up for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And
I know.
obviously when it's raining, it's a nice thing to have, but if you're on the second floor, third floor of a building, or if you're a retail tenant, it's something that is impacting your business in a negative fashion.
So let's talk about. I brought up the rubber ruler, and the problem with space anywhere is not that how people are measuring the square footage you're paying your rent against. There are
Right.
some buildings that are much more efficient in terms of how they're laid out, the central elevators and so forth. And
Mhm.
where they're measuring the space. One of the buildings, I always ask people to send me blueprints, and when they did, sometimes you found out that they were measuring your space from the outside of the building.
Well, ironically enough, the real estate board in New York standard allows the landlord,
Mhm.
they're not measuring from outside the building, but they're measuring from the middle of the exterior wall.
Ah,
And, when I started in the business, lo these 40 years ago, a standard full floor loss factor, which is the difference between the rentable and the usable square footage, was 16%.
that's not
Now,
bad.
bear in mind that usable square footage is different than carpetable. Usable is basically the area within a particular space. And if you're taking a full floor, you're factoring out the penetrations into the floor. So that would be fire stairs and elevators. But if you're getting into carpetable, then you're factoring out space absorbed by columns, and you're also factoring out the space absorbed by convector covers. And obviously in some of the older vintage buildings, some of these convector covers, which are, covers for the radiator, et cetera, they can take up as much as 3 feet from the perimeter of the space to the interior. So it's an important consideration when you look at, rentable versus usable versus carpetable. So a full floor loss factor now is roughly around 28%. Some landlords are going to try and push that to 30%. But just to give you an understanding of what that means that, 40 years ago, if you rented a 10,000 square foot space, what you could use was 8,400 feet.
Mhm.
What it means now is that you can use 7,200 square feet. Obviously, a big difference. And
Huge,
the
yeah.
reason that the landlords do this is to try and keep the rent within a palatable range. Because obviously, if you were to bill on cost per usable, or something of that nature, a $70 rent becomes $120 a foot, and that would give pause to a lot of people. So
For
the
sure.
key is to really understand, by virtue of the space program that we ask the tenant to fill out, we then we have them fill out the pre-programming questionnaire so that we understand what they need and what their growth pattern is. We then translate that into what's called a space program. So then we understand exactly how much space they need on a usable and rentable basis. And that basically makes the space search that much more efficient. The other thing, space, in addition to kind of that rather expensive checklist that I refer to, is post 9/11, obviously, emergency evacuation has become a critical issue, and for some of us, a very emotionally charged issue.
Mhm.
So one of the things that we do once we get down to, the top choices, is we looked at what is the condition of the fire stairs. Now, if you're in a midtown building, you know, 10 times out of 10, that's not going to be an issue. We're still going to inspect them to make sure that there's no obstructions, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're
Mhm.
dealing in a Midtown South issue, the condition of the fire stairs can really dramatically vary from building to building. I'll give you an
Sure.
example. We were representing a tenant down on Lower Broadway, and they were on the 7th floor, so I walked the fire stairs. And on the 4th floor, there was a cast iron radiator, I kid you not, that was 4.5 feet long. Now, in my younger days, when I was weight training 4 days a week, 3 hours a day, I probably could have moved that to the side, but such is no longer the case.
Mhm.
And so imagine, there's a sound of fire, people are panicking, there's smoke, and they go running down the fire stairs only to have to navigate around a 4.5 foot, 400-pound cast iron radiator that's basically blocking the landing. So
Wow.
obviously that was uncovered as part of our due diligence. We made sure that the landlord removed that obstruction. But, all too often, building managers use the landing of a building as an area to store ladders or, buckets or mops or any host of building sundries. And, you need to make sure that those fire stairs are totally unencumbered. You also need to make sure that the fluorescent markings on the railings are in place, that the fluorescent markings on the stairs are in place, and that the emergency lighting, which is required by code at every landing, is fully operational. And also to make sure that they're, cleaned and mopped at least once a week. So those are the kind of extra details that we pick up. The other thing we do is, again, once we get down to the final couple of choices, we have a 8-point questionnaire, what I call the consumer satisfaction survey, where myself or one of my associates will call 5 tenants in the building and say, we are representing a tenant that's thinking about moving into your building. Do you have 10 minutes to answer 8 questions? And we run them through, their assessment of the building staff, their responsiveness, any internet connectivity issues, air conditioning issues, heating issues, et cetera. And also, obviously, we've added, how was their compliance with COVID, with the COVID mandates? Were you satisfied? Do you feel safe? Were they responsive? Et cetera, et cetera. Also, how are the elevators? And then we ask them to score the building on a scale of 1 to 10. Anything below an 8 is a problem. So this is our way of getting a direct pipeline to a very valuable information source, because obviously, the landlord, he or she can say anything that they want about the building. The landlord's agent, he or she can say whatever they want about the building. But the pipeline to the truth and the only opinion that really matters is the tenants that are actually in the building.
I'm
So,
sure
we get that
surprises from time
information
to time.
and we incorporate that. What's
I said,
that?
I'm sure you encounter surprises from time to time.
Yes, some unpleasant surprises.
Those are the only kind of
the other variances that you need to consider. That's right. The other variances you need to consider the source. So we recently, or pre-COVID, we did a deal on 7th Avenue. We interviewed 5 tenants. 4 of them scored it 8 or above. 1 scored it a 10. 1 scored it a 6. And that was a law firm. So, no disrespect to lawyers, but sometimes, they tend to be a little bit more litigious and a little bit more demanding than the average tenant. So, but you highlight all the scores and we put together it in a report that we give a verbatim report to the tenant, so that way they can thoroughly understand exactly what the level of consumer satisfaction is. Obviously, the other thing that we do is
COVID-19, Brian, are you thinking that tenants are going to do shorter leases because they just don't know what the future brings? And are people seriously downsizing? Their belief systems are that people aren't coming back to the office in droves. What are you seeing?
Well, that's a good question. And, I can tell you that of the recent transactions that we have negotiated, they have all been short-term 12 to 18-month renewals, because exactly for the reason you cited, the tenants in question were unsure how much space they were going to need post-COVID. So we kind of kicked the can down the road. The good news is that landlords were very, very aggressive in terms of the rents that they were willing to give. So we had a tenant recently, the asking rent in the building was $50 a foot, and we secured them a renewal of 18 months at $33 a foot with 1 month of free rent. So the net effective was right around $31 a foot, and that was for 18 months. As for more permanent, commitments, we have a consulting services team that actually works with tenants them to really effectively understand exactly how much space they will need post-COVID. And I think, it's going to vary from user group to user group.
Oh, sure.
But, I think it's safe to assume that most tenants will be able to reduce their footprint anywhere between 15 to 35%, depending upon, how many tenants are going to work from home, how many offices will be shared, how many workstations will be shared, how many bench positions will be shared,
Yeah,
what do
it's
you
a
do in
complex
terms of
equation.
files, et cetera, et cetera.
It's pretty complex.
Yeah, and I think, obviously the other vagary in the market right now is that, and I think those that have read my uh, my news blurb or my real estate column in your newsletter,
Yeah.
they're aware that there's a tremendous overhang of sublease space. And, the overhang right now is in the neighborhood of 25 million square feet. And until that overhang is absorbed, that will continue to be a drag on the rents that landlords will be able to command, because oftentimes they'll be competing for a tenant who is considering a sublease in their building. They're going to be looking at direct space and sublease space. So in that instance, a landlord is competing against one of their own tenants for a new occupier. And, if you're a sub landlord and you have 15,000 square feet that you want to sublease for 5 or 6 years, you just want to get the deal done. You're going to say initially, I want to make a little profit.
I enjoyed your 3 stages of grief.
Right. Initially, it's, I want to make a
Bring me a
profit.
dollar.
Then it's,
Okay, if I can break
get me
even.
what I'm paying. And then it's just get me anything that you can. And when I'm representing a tenant, obviously we track how long a space has been on the market, and where the best deals are is when a sub landlord is in the get me anything that you want phase.
Yeah.
And, that's where we've been able to deliver tremendous value, where, a building where on a direct basis, a landlord is getting $80 a foot, and we're able to get a sublease at $50 a foot. And, on a long-term basis of 6, 7, 8 years, that's tremendous value. That's tremendous asset value that we can deliver to our client, provided, of course, the sub landlord is creditworthy, and we do a whole, deep dive in terms of their financials, because obviously you don't want to do a sublease and then have the sub landlord go into bankruptcy, and then the landlord knocks on your door and said, well, you can stay in the building, but now you got to pay me the direct rent price. So, like everything else, you got to do your homework.
Yeah, you have to. So the chat box is open. We have another 10 minutes roughly to talk. If no one has any
There's
questions.
nothing in the chat box. I've been monitoring it. There's nothing.
Matt, do you mind if I introduce myself?
Sure, go ahead.
Ryan, first of all, thanks for using Cushman Wakefield space for the FANG. I was with Cushman Wakefield for 27 years. Although we know each other, I appreciated your presentation. I spent 27 years on the inside in real estate, and then had the opportunity to work for a client. So some of the questions I had, I think you answered. And I think the big question is everybody coming back to work and how the effect is on leases. I think you answered that partly in that leases that are being negotiated going forward are going to have a clause in the lease where the tenant will be protected. And I was at a company that actually opened up a building on February 17th in Paramus. March 17th, COVID hit, and we had to vacate. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the long term, what the effect is going to be in real estate, and maybe construction also, because I was dealing with build outs of space with a tenant. What do you think is going to happen
Right.
long term with construction and build out of space?
I mean, when I talk to architects, in the industry, what they are forecasting after people are comfortable with the vaccination and everything else, they're forecasting a tremendous upsurge in work. So I think in terms of construction, I think that that will probably continue with very little drop off. I mean, obviously you have some tenants that will say, I don't want to move into new space that has to be built from scratch. Let me try and renew, let me try and sublease out a portion, or let me try and segment out a portion of my space and get the landlord to kind of take that back. And then I'll renew, and then I'll just do kind of cosmetic work, new paint, you know, carpeting, repartition some offices, open up the space more, you know, buy some additional workstations as opposed to going to moving to a less office intensive environment. I think, you know, the impact on construction, Kevin, I think will not be overly severe. You know, I think you'll see some downturn due to the, you know, more tenants may be inclined to renew. But I think, you know, you may see also a balancing out, because obviously if a tenant that's in 30,000 feet goes to 15,000 feet, they're going to have to go to new space. And that space is probably going to have to be reconfigured, which would require construction, or will have to be built from scratch. And, you know, you've got a lot of landlords that are now dealing with very advanced air filtration systems and, you know, air exchange systems. They're increasing the CFMs of the ventilation systems to deal with people's concern about getting more and more fresh air. And obviously that's where, you know, landlords down in Midtown South may have a little bit of an advantage, because a lot of the windows of those buildings are operable. So you can just open the window. Obviously you need to then get fresh air to the interior. So I think then, you know, you're going to have construction dealing with enhanced ventilation systems, et cetera, more heavy duty air conditioning distribution. So I think overall, I would forecast that the impact on construction would not be overly significant. I think it'll be fine.
No,
Thank you.
hopefully everybody on the call is a CFO or controller type, and my feeling is people are going to start coming back to the office. There's a high value from a corporate standpoint of people running into each other in the hallway and at the coffee. I don't see how, you know, there's all remote work that we've
Yeah, I mean, that's,
managed. It is a great thing that we've been able to do this, and we've had to. But to get everybody together back at the office, I think has great value. And Manhattan is Manhattan.
Anyway, Brian, there's a question here regarding tax. I'm sorry, I just lost it. The tax, they want to know if you have any thoughts about future income tax on non-New York residents, remote workers, and its impact on New York real estate and corporate home office locations. So it's all about taxes in those three buckets: remote workers that don't live in New York, real estate, and corporate home locations.
that would really be an accounting question. What I can tell you is that our strategic advisory group with respect to real estate taxes on commercial property is forecasting that there will be an increase in the mill rate, because obviously, you know, with the American Recovery Program or Recovery Program that was just passed by the Senate, hopefully will be passed by the House, you know, a lot of that will go to ameliorate the budget shortfalls that a lot of city and state governments are dealing with. But absent that, you know, city and state governments may be looking at increasing the mill rate on commercial buildings, which will then increase taxes, which are of course passed through to the tenants over and above a negotiated base year based on their proportionate share of taxes in the building. So
Okay,
I'm
and
sure I can't answer your question about, you know, personal income tax, but I can tell you that will be the impact potentially on commercial real estate.
okay, and another thing, I guess a part of that was they wanted to know that regarding, do you know anything about individual income tax for non-New New York residents who no longer work in New York? That sounds like it's an accounting question too, and wouldn't be.
I think those are really outside of
I
Brian's
think
area.
they are not really in
Yeah.
your
They
wheelhouse.
are high in number, but still. these
They're
are-
not in your wheelhouse, so I'm sorry, but that was it.
That's okay.
I think it's be more important. You mentioned that they're going to, landlords are being asked to provide more bicycle space. And obviously they're also being asked to improve the quality of their air handling systems. Is there something we haven't discussed that they're being asked to do? Brian?
No, I mean, I don't think that there's any city mandates with respect to air filtration, but I think it's something that landlords, particularly in the Class A buildings, are going to be doing because, as I said, there's going to be a lot of competition for occupiers that are out there looking at new locations. So the degree to which a landlord can say that we've got those advanced systems in our building, that will hopefully enable them to be, more competitive with some of the other landlords that are out there.
Yeah.
Okay,
So-
and then there was a question about subleasing. Do you think subleasing
Yep.
is increasingly common option in contracts even for small companies? What's your opinion on subleasing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, very viable option. I think that there are subleases out there that range everywhere from, 1,000 square feet to, 500,000 square feet. And provided that you do your due diligence on the sublandlord, as I said, to make sure that they don't go into any kind of financial distress during the course of the sublease, I think that there's tremendous value that can be delivered there, both by virtue of a lower rent than a landlord might be willing to offer, additional free rent, and most importantly, the fact that oftentimes a sublease is fully fixtured. It's got furniture in there. It's wired for telecom, for computers and phones. You've got flat screens, TVs that are on the walls. You've got a fully fixtured kitchen, et cetera, et cetera. Some of which would be an upfront cost to a tenant if they were moving into direct space, because typically direct space is, it's just
Unimproved.
empty. So
Yeah.
you're saving the cost of cabling, you're saving the cost of furniture, they're saving the cost of, any additional fixtures like flat screens, TVs, artwork, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be a very viable option. The key is that you don't want to get landlocked. So you want a sublease that is of a sufficient term. So for example, you don't want to do, well, you could, but you need to be aware of this. If you're going into an $80 building and you're getting a sublease at $50 a foot, you have to be aware that when the sublease expires, you're probably going to have to move again. But, for some tenants, that's a very viable way to go, and it can convey tremendous cost savings to the bottom line, depending upon the length of the sublease that you're able to secure.
Okay, another question says,
I try to make the meetings end on time as well. Someone has a question about looking for space for 30 employees, and Brian should probably, Kurt Sung, I would suggest you contact Brian directly. His information was in our meeting announcement. And if you twist his arm, I'm sure he'll be happy to speak with you. Brian, well, you're willing to talk to
Absolutely.
people, right?
Yeah.
No, these are all good questions, and I try to have my meetings begin on time and end on time. So we're going to end right now. Brian, is there any last things you wanted to mention? Something we forgot?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry that I felt like I maybe talked too much, and obviously I want to try and make this as interactive as possible and convey as much information as possible. So if you want to kind of reconvene this in a couple of weeks, I'm happy to talk less and listen more, put it that way.
So Brian,
Answer more questions.
sure. So let me remove you for the moment. And thank you for joining us on Chat with Matt. Brian has a regular column. I hope he'll keep doing it. And so you'll see his contact information at the bottom.
yes,
And
hi,
certainly
Matt, how are
reach
you?
out to him.
Hi,
now that you've
Fantastic.
come
Thank you
on,
so much
chat
for
with
taking the
Matt,
time.
know he's somebody
I was
you-
just wrapping up a Zoom call and I didn't want to
Somebody
have
is
to hear
not
the
there.
background noise. That's
Please
awfully,
mute,
awfully discourteous to you.
please mute. Somebody's not, somebody's didn't mute.
That doesn't matter. We're at the end. I want to thank everybody for joining me on Chat with Matt. And we have another session tomorrow, which I hope you'll join us for. It's been announced in the newsletter. But for now, I want to thank all of you for sticking with us. And Brian, of course, for joining us on Chat with Matt. So everybody stay safe. If you can make a donation, that's how we keep the lights on here in our real estate of the FENG and build our website. So thank you for joining me on Chat with Matt, and we'll see you again, as they say, see you around campus. Brian, thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you.